Rome shimmered like gold and rotted like flesh. The year was 1492, and in the shadow of St. Peter's, power changed hands not with prayers but with bribes heavy as iron. At the center of it all stood a man with a predator's smile, Rodrigo Borgia. To the world, he was Pope Alexander VI, God's chosen vicar on earth. To those who truly knew him, he was something far more dangerous, a kingmaker, a schemer, and a man who would burn heaven itself if it meant holding the keys to it. But Rodrigo's story was only the beginning. It was his children who would ignite the fire that burned through Renaissance Italy, and none shone, or scandalized, more than his golden-haired daughter, Lucrezia. In a court thick with incense and whispers, her name became both weapon and curse. Were the Borgias truly the monsters history made them? Or were they victims of the most devastating weapon in Rome, rumor sharpened into legend? What if the darkest whispers about Lucrezia, the incest, the poison, the sins too vile to name, weren't born of truth at all, but of envy? Long before the world called him Your Holiness, Rodrigo Borgia understood one thing better than any priest or prince. In Rome, salvation was bought, not earned. Born into a Spanish family far from noble blood, Rodrigo climbed the church's ladder one calculated step at a time. His secret wasn't piety, it was power. When his uncle became Pope Calixtus III, Rodrigo's fate was sealed. With a stroke of nepotism disguised as divine favor, the young man was made a cardinal at just 25, and from that moment he began building an empire. Gold flowed like holy water, whispered promises bound cardinals like chains, and the Vatican's corridors became his hunting ground. By the summer of 1492, the papal throne was within reach. The conclave that chose the next pope wasn't a solemn council of saints, it was an auction. Rodrigo's coffers opened, and votes followed. When the smoke cleared, the Spanish cardinal emerged as Pope Alexander VI. But this wasn't a victory of faith, it was the birth of a dynasty. Rodrigo had no intention of ruling as a humble servant of God. The papacy was a weapon, and he would use it to carve the name Borgia into the bones of Italy. And if the church was his sword, his children would become his sharpened edge. Transition. Hook. But the blade he forged in his daughter, Lucrezia, would cut deeper than even he imagined. From the moment she was born, Lucrezia Borgia wasn't a daughter. She was a bargaining chip carved in silk and gold. Rodrigo adored her, yes, but his love was never simple. To him, she wasn't just his child, she was leverage. Raised in the shadow of St. Peter's, Lucrezia learned early that smiles could be weapons, and innocence could be armor. Her education was rare for a woman of her age, languages, poetry, statecraft, but behind every lesson was a single unspoken truth. Her life wasn't her own. By the age of 13, she was already promised to Giovanni Sforza, Lord of Pesaro. To the world, it was a wedding. To Rodrigo, it was a transaction. Each marriage was a chess move in the Vatican's bloody game of power, and Lucrezia was the queen he pushed across the board. Yet here's the question that has haunted history. Was she merely a pawn in her father's schemes, or was there steel hidden beneath that golden hair? Contemporary letters hint at a girl far sharper than her gentle reputation suggested. Some saw her as pliant and obedient. Others whispered she was a quiet strategist, learning to play the same ruthless game as her father and brother. Whether victim or architect, one thing was clear. Every time Lucrezia smiled, another door opened for the Borgia dynasty. Transition, hook, but with every door came whispers, and the most poisonous of all would nearly destroy her. It started as a whisper, the kind of rumor that slithers through corridors and clings to shadows. When Lucrezia's marriage to Giovanni Sforza collapsed, it should have been routine Vatican politics. Alliances shifted, the deal was no longer useful, and Rodrigo needed his daughter free for a better match. But the annulment cut deeper than anyone expected. Giovanni left Rome humiliated, forced to sign papers declaring his marriage unconsummated, a public confession of impotence. And humiliation breeds vengeance. To save face, he struck back with words sharper than any blade. Lucrezia wasn't untouched because of him. She was untouched because her father and brother had already claimed her. It was a scandal designed to scorch, and Rome was ready to believe it. Pamphlets appeared overnight, woodcuts showing the Pope, his son Cesare, and Lucrezia entwined in grotesque caricatures. The accusations weren't whispered anymore. They were sung in taverns, scrawled on church walls, and muttered in the Vatican itself. Was there truth to it? Historians almost universally say no. The so-called evidence comes from the mouths of bitter enemies and propaganda machines. But the truth didn't matter. In a world obsessed with sin and salvation, nothing was more delicious or more damning than incest. And the rumors found fertile ground in the family's own behavior. Cesare hovered at Lucrezia's side like a wolf guarding prey, dismissing her suitors with a glance that promised violence. Rodrigo's open pride in his daughter was read not as paternal love, but as something darker. The line between devotion and scandal blurred until even allies shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Transition. Hook. But whispers alone weren't enough to cement the Borgia legend. Rome needed something deadlier, and soon the rumors would find their perfect partner: poison. In Renaissance Rome, power wasn't taken with sword alone, it was poured into goblets. The Borgias understood this better than anyone, and soon another word began to stalk their name: poison. Whispers of a substance called cantarella crept through the city, a pale, sweet-tasting venom said to leave no trace but a corpse. Some claimed it was slipped into wine at banquets, others swore it was baked into sugared fruits. No one could prove it existed, yet every sudden death in the Vatican fed the legend. When Alfonso of Aragon, Lucrezia's second husband, was found bleeding out in a dark Roman alley in 1500, the poison stories turned into accusations. He was young, handsome, and most dangerously of all, useful one day, expendable the next. Rome's verdict was swift. Cesare Borgia had ordered his death. Was it politics or jealousy? That question became the match that set fire to every other rumor. Some said Alfonso had been too close to Lucrezia in a way that made her brother seethe. Others saw a simple, ruthless calculation. Naples was no longer valuable, and alliances built on love meant nothing to the Borgias. And Lucrezia? She wept publicly over her husband's broken body. But tears in Rome were never proof of innocence or guilt. Her grief became another mask for the city to interpret. To some, she was a widow, to others, an accomplice. Did the Borgias truly use poison as a weapon? Historians debate it to this day. There are no surviving vials, no written confessions, only a trail of corpses and a legend that refuses to die. Transition, hook. But poison and murder were just tools. The real weapon was the story itself, the black legend that turned the Borgias into monsters Rome would never forget. For the Borgias, power was never their only enemy. Envy was. Rome had seen corruption before, but never so brazen, never so unapologetic, and that made the family a perfect target. The whispers of incest and poison weren't born in a vacuum. They were crafted, sharpened, and spread by rival families who wanted the Borgias erased. The powerful Orsini, the Della Rovere, the Sforza, they all had one thing in common. They feared a Spanish pope turning the Vatican into a family throne. Pamphlets littered the piazzas at dawn, crude woodcuts of Lucrezia in her father's arms, of Cesare raising a poisoned cup. Verses twisted prayers into filth. O Holy Father who art in bed, unhallowed be thy name. It was propaganda designed to cut deeper than any dagger, and it worked. Even Rome's own xenophobia poured fuel on the fire. To the Italian elite, the Borgias weren't just corrupt, they were foreigners. Spanish blood made their ambition an insult, their success a crime. Every rumor of incest wasn't just scandal, it was a way to make them other, to paint them as abominations unfit for God's throne. And perhaps the most dangerous part, the stories were irresistible. The Vatican had become a stage, and the Borgias were the perfect villains. Historians like Machiavelli and Guicciardini repeated the tales without proof, giving rumour the weight of history, fiction calcified into fact. The Black Legend wasn't just gossip, it was a war waged not with armies but with ink and whispers. And while swords could kill men, rumours could kill dynasties. Transition. Hook. But Lucrezia's story didn't end in Rome's poisoned corridors. Against every scandal and every lie, she would reinvent herself in a place no one expected. When Lucrezia Borgia left Rome for Ferrara in 1502, It wasn't just a marriage, it was an escape. Her third husband, Alfonso d'Este, Duke of Ferrara, wasn't a lovesick pawn or a political bargaining chip. He was a ruler in his own right, pragmatic and unshaken by the storm that followed her name. "I care little for gossip," he told her on their wedding day, "only for loyalty." It was the first offer of stability Lucrezia had ever known. In Ferrara, far from the Vatican's poisoned corridors, she began to rebuild herself. No longer the papal pawn, she became the duchess who fed the poor during famine, who turned her court into a sanctuary for poets and painters. Under her patronage, Ferrara blossomed into a jewel of Renaissance art and culture. The people whispered still, but the whispers began to change. Yet redemption was never simple. The past clung to her like a shadow. Pamphlets smuggled into the city reminded Ferrara who their duchess had been. Masquerade guests glanced twice at her smile, wondering if it hid poison. Even charity couldn't erase the stain of her name. But Lucrezia adapted. She commissioned portraits that showed her as a pious mother and devoted wife. She endowed convents and orphanages, carving a new story in stone and canvas. Piece by piece, she buried the old Lucrezia and built a new one. And still, on quiet nights, the past returned. The Vatican's gilded halls, the laughter of a brother now buried, the calculating smile of a father long dead. Ferrara was her sanctuary, but it was also her mirror, reflecting both who she had become and the ghosts she could never outrun. Transition hook. And when death finally came for her, history was left with one question. Had she escaped the Borgia curse, or carried it with her into eternity? Lucrezia Borgia died in 1519 at the age of 39, far from the Vatican that had made her infamous. In Ferrara they mourned a duchess, a mother, a patron of the arts. But in Rome, they remembered something else. Not the woman, but the myth. That's the curse of the Borgias. Their real sins, bribery, ambition, even murder, were the currency of Renaissance politics. Every ruling house in Italy played the same bloody game, but the rumours, the whispers of incest and poison, those turned the Borgias into something more than corrupt. They turned them into monsters, and monsters never die. Was Lucrezia a pawn, a player, or both? Was she a victim of her father's schemes, or a quiet architect of her own destiny? History can't decide, because the truth doesn't matter as much as the story we've chosen to tell. The black legend outlived them all, written not in scripture or law, but in ink stained with envy and fear. Maybe that's the real scandal, that 5 centuries later, we're still repeating the lies as if they were truth. Maybe the Borgias' greatest crime wasn't what they did, but what they made us believe. Because in the end, history doesn't remember what happened. History remembers the whispers,